Welcome to this deep dive on the barriers assessment, where the milestones assessment asks what a child can do, the barriers assessment asks what's standing in the way. So let's dig in. So there are four things that we're going to cover today: why the barriers assessment exists and how it relates to the milestones assessment, because they are designed to be read together, and the 24 barriers themselves, which will organize into 5 practical groupings for the training purposes: behavior and compliance, absent and defective verbal operants, social and fundamental learning process barriers, and competing or physical barriers. And how scoring works on the 0 to 4 scale, and how to actually use a barrier data alongside milestones to prioritize what an intervention program tackles first. Okay, cool? Cool. So the barriers assessment is designed to identify and score 24 learning and language acquisition barriers that might impede a child's progress. Okay? So its purpose is simply determine whether a barrier exists, and once one is flagged, a more detailed functional analysis is what actually determines the right intervention. So here's the piece that trips people up the first time they see this assessment. It turns in the opposite direction from the milestones assessment. Okay, so one on milestones assessment, the higher is better, while on barriers, lower is better. A score of 0 means no significant barriers exists, and scores climbing towards 4 mean a more severe problem in more urgent need for formal intervention. And this is why the two assessments are designed to be read side by side, because barriers and scales gaps are often connected. So a child who needs to learn to mand according to the milestones data might also be excessively prompt bound and guessing, like scrolling through a response when he does mand according to the barriers data. Both problems have to be addressed, or the man training alone won't produce a man that actually works for the child in daily life. Right, so the VBMAP guide itself frames the 24 barriers as falling into several categories. And this deck organizes them into 5 practical groupings for training purposes. Okay, so group 1 is behavior and compliance. So it involves negative behavior and poor instructional control, meaning escape and avoidance. Whereas group 2 is the largest, which has absent, weak, or defective verbal operants and related skills like MAD, tact, motor imitation, echoic, VPMTS, what else? Listener repertoires, and intraverbal. And group 3 stands alone, like absent, weak, or defective social skills. While group 4 covers fundamental learning process barriers like prompt dependency, scrolling, defective scanning, failure to make conditional discrimination, failure to generalize, weak or atypical motivating operation, response requirement, weakening the MO, and reinforcement dependency. And lastly, for group 5 covers competing behaviors and physical barriers like self-stimulation, articulation problem, obsessive compulsive behaviors, hyperactivity, failure to make eye contact or attend to people, and sensory defensiveness. We'll walk through each group with concrete details on the next several slides. So this is what the assessment form looks like. It's the same as the milestones assessment. You have to fill in the child's or client's details, name, date of birth, and age of testing. And again, I'm going to explain to you further on how the score would look like in the next slide. So every one of the 24 barriers is rated 0 to 4 using the criteria printed on the protocol VBMAP book. Pages 25 through 29 and scores of 1 through 4 are transferred to the barrier scoring form on protocol page 5. All right, so let's go on to the scoring. So a score of 0 is recorded in the assessment itself but deliberately left blank on the scoring form. So the form only visualizes where barriers actually exist. So walking on across a scale, 0 means no problem, no significant barriers, no intervention needed. And 1 means an occasional problem, so worth monitoring, but it may not need a formal intervention yet. And 2 means a moderate problem where further analysis and possibly an intervention program should be considered before things get worse. And 3 means a persist problem that's in need of a behavioral analysis and a formal intervention program. And lastly, 4 means a severe problem behavior or severe problem occurring several times a day, sometimes presenting a danger to the child or others that needs a formal intervention program, often urgently. Right, so group 1 covers behavior and compliance, where the barriers most likely to need immediate attention because they can block everything else. So negative behavior covers tantrums, aggression, property destruction, and self-injury. So the scores reflects frequency and severity from occasional crying or whining at 1 up to daily severe behavior that presents a danger to the child or others at a 4. And these behaviors are usually, even if inadvertently, reinforced by adults, whether that's removing a demand, delivering attention, or handing over a desired item to end a scene. Okay, so next is poor instructional control refers specifically to escape and avoidance. So these are behaviors a child uses to delay or remove a demand placed on them, ranging from mild things like looking away and not responding or up to aggression. So it's treated as its own separate barrier, distinct from general negative behavior because of how common and how disruptive to teaching it is on its own. So group 2 is the largest of the 5, covering 7 barriers tied to the core verbal operants and related skills. So first is defective MAND. So this is where the child may have solid tact, listener, and echoic skills, but MANDs themselves are few in number, like prompt, bound, wrote, or scrolled, guessed through. So this is a major barrier because manding is what lets a child inform adults of urgent motivators in the moment, and it's a big part of early bonding process between a child and caregiver. So next is the defective tact. The tact repertoire is generally less prone to becoming defective than mand or intraverbal because nonverbal stimulus control tends to be clearer and more measurable, but the problem is still show up, like the wrong stimulus acquiring control or rote tacting or a lag specifically on more complex tasks like adjectives, preposition, or pronouns. Whereas defective motor imitation, like imitation may become prompt bound, either physical or verbal, may fail to generalize across conditions, or in a less obvious problem, the child may start copying inappropriate behaviors modeled by others. So motor imitation is a foundational skill underneath play, self-help, and sign-based communication systems. So continuing group 2, defective echoic, this is one go wrong in two opposite directions. Either it's too weak, meaning no echo at all, or too strong, meaning echolalia or scripting, excessive out of context repeating of previously heard words. And delayed echolalia in particular may actually function as a form of self-stimulation. So either direction, echoic skill is a key early predictor of how language develop unfolds. And next is defective VPMTS, or visual performance skills and matching to sample. So this covers errors like failing to scan comparison array, developing a side or position bias, or scrolling. So guessing repeatedly until reinforcement happens to land. So it's a genuine complex task because it requires attending to two stimuli at once. Technically, what's called a conditional discrimination, right? And defective listener repertoire, or LD or LRFFC, this is what most people call receptive language, right? So scanning failure, position bias, or the same problem showing up specifically once a task involves multiple verbal components, like being asked to find a food that's hot, right? And lastly, defective intraverbal. So defective intraverbal is the hardest verbal opera to teach and the most prone to becoming defective, like showing up as a rote responding, failure to maintain a back and forth conversation, or answering that technical words but ignored the actual question that was asked. So group 3 stands alone: absent, weak, and defective social skills. Because social behavior is very complex and it depends on social rules that shift depending on the setting and the specific group of people, right? So, because what's accepted with one group isn't necessarily accepted with another. And here's the key insight from the guide. So, social skills can be undermined by almost any of the other 23 barriers on this assessment, like the behavior problems, defective man, self-stimulation, hyperactivity, sensory defectiveness. All of it can interfere with a child's ability to socially engage. But the main focus of this particular item is age-appropriate interaction, specifically with peers, and not just with adults. Since typically developing children are actually more interested in adults than peers until around 2.5 or 3 years old. So that's the baseline of this measured against. So walking the scale briefly, A1 means social behavior is growing but trailing behind the child's of other milestones. A 2 means rarely initiating with peers or showing minor aggression like grabbing toys. And a 3 means staying apart during play and not sharing or taking turns and not responding to peers and mans. And 4 means the child has the language skills to interact but actively avoids other children. So the takeaway for this group is it's only one barrier on the form, but it's the one most likely to be a downstream symptom of a problem documented elsewhere on this same assessment. So group 4 covers 8 fundamental learning process barriers, like the problem that once removed tend to unlock progress across many skills at once rather than just one. Okay, so prompt dependent means the desired behavior only shows up when a prompt is present. And often that prompt is something subtle like eye gaze or a head nod that was simply never faded out of the teaching procedure. So this tends to permeate many different skill areas for a child at once and not just a single task, you know? So the next is scrolling. So this is guessing, like cycling through several previous reinforced responses instead of emitting the correct one immediately. For example, being asked what something is and saying car, then hat, then book until one lands. So it can show up in any verbal operand like man, tack, interverbal, all of it. While defective scanning is like failing to visually attend to the full array of choices before responding. So tell here is a child's eyes. If they immediately focus on the array, that's good. But if they're looking at the adult's face or hands instead, that's the red flag for a scanning problem because they didn't know what to do and scan. And failure to make conditional discrimination. This means this is struggling specifically with tasks that requires attending to two interlocking stimuli at once. So like matching to sample task where the sample items changes what counts as correct in the comparison array. So this becomes a common barrier once teaching moves past single stimulus response training into more complex real-world tasks. Continuing group 4, so failure to generalize. So this is where a child acquires exactly what's directly taught and provides no variation beyond that. And there are two types worth distinguishing: the stimulus generalization, where a trained response should transfer to a new, untrained example of the same thing. And response generalization is where a stimulus should be able to evoke more than one correct response and not always identical. And weak or atypical MOs, or motivating operation, is either the child has a narrow range of things that motivate them, or the things that do motivate them are odd or atypical. So it's like just like repeated motions, specific patterns, colors, sounds, which makes it genuinely difficult for a teacher to create and capture teaching opportunities. Whereas response requirement weakens the MO, it is where an item might be highly reinforcing when it's free, but the moment any response, effort, or demand gets attached to earning it, its value as a reinforcer collapses. And reinforcement dependent. So this is where the child only performs when a very specific and often fairly artificial reinforcement is delivered, and the behavior doesn't hold up under the thinner or more natural reinforcement schedules. So the kind you'd actually find more in a typical classroom or at home. So here's the group 5, covers competing behaviors and physical barriers. So top of our list is the self-stimulation. So it is a repetitive, automatically reinforcing behavior, right? So it can be motor or vocal that can compete directly with a child's ability to attend instruction at the moment. And we have articulation problem, or physical or motor speech limitation that make verbal responses hard for a listener to understand. So entirely separate from whether the child's underlying verbal repertoire is actually there. And the next one is obsessive compulsive behavior, refers to the rigid repetitive routines or ritual that interferes with flexible and learning and teaching. And the next one is hyperactivity, means difficulty remaining seated or on task long enough for instruction to actually occur. And the next one is failure to make eye contact or attend to people limit a child's access to modeled language, social cues, instructional input all day long, and not just during formal teaching sessions. And the last one, sensory defensiveness, covers aversive reactions to touch, sound, texture, or other sensory input, which can disrupt both teaching materials and physical prompt procedure. So these 6 are grouped together because, unlike the learning process barriers in group 4, they're less about how the child learns and more about behaviors or physical factors that actively compete with the opportunity to learn in the first place. Alright, so here is the single most important interpretative point in this whole assessment. So barriers data is designed to be read alongside the milestones assessment data and not on its own. So the guide's own work example makes this concrete. Say the milestones assessment shows a child need to learn to man. So looked at alone, that just tells you to start man training. But the barriers assessment might reveal that this same child is also excessively prompt bound and guessing through the responses when attempting to man. So both of these barriers have to be removed from the man repertoire to actually grow and become functional. Okay? So man training on its own without addressing the prompt dependency and scrolling will not be enough. So you'd just be teaching more mans that are equally prompt bound and equally unreliable. And more generally, comparing a child's milestone and barrier scores side by side, which the protocol makes literally possible by placing those 2 summary forms on page 4 and 5. So points an intervention program towards its most focused priority. And sometimes that priority isn't language or academic instruction at all. Sometimes a program genuinely needs to focus on removing a barrier first before other instruction can even become more effective or even effective. And this is what the VBMAP barriers assessment looks like. You can read them and score what is appropriate for your client. Okay, to recap, the barriers assessment covers 24 learning language barriers, which we've organized into 5 practical groups for the training purposes. And before and compliance, absence or defective verbal operance, social skills, fundamental learning process barriers, and competing or physical barriers. And it's scored 0 to 4, and unlike the milestones assessment, a lower score is a good score. 0 means no significant barriers exist, and score from 1 through 4 get transferred to the barriers scores form. A 0 is recorded in the assessment but not marked on the form itself. And the single most important habit to build, barriers data is most useful when it's read alongside milestones assessment. So together, the 2 point towards what an intervention program should actually prioritize first. And next, we'll look at how the transition assessment builds on the milestones and barriers data to inform a placement decision. Alright, so this deck is grounded directly in Chapter 6 of the VBMAP guide, the barriers assessment scoring instructions, along with the barriers assessment scoring criteria in the protocol. And everything here is paraphrased for internal training purposes. And one thing worth flagging explicitly is the 5 grouping used through this deck: behavior and compliance, verbal operance, social learning process, and competing physical barriers are an organizational aid built for this training. Okay, so not an official numbered category system from the VBMAP itself. So for the full authoritative scoring criteria on each of the 24 barriers, go directly to the guide and protocol. Cool.